Cities First, Rural Development Later. This book is an outcome of my curiosity about why some cities grow and why others stagnate and decay. I have relied greatly and gratefully upon the findings, reliable as far as I am able to judge, of many scholars, historians, and archaeologists in particular. But I have not necessarily adopted their views about the meanings of their findings in my effort to develop a theory of city economic growth. One of many surprises I found in the course of this walk was especially unsettling because it ran counter to so much I had always taken for granted. Superficially, it seemed to run counter to common sense, and yet there it was. Work that we usually consider rural has originated not in the countryside but in cities. Current theory in many fields, economics, history, anthropology, assumes that cities are built upon a rural economic base. If my observations and reasoning are correct, the reverse is true. That is, rural economies, including agricultural work, are directly built upon city economies and city work. So thoroughly does the theory, in my view, the dogma of agricultural premises saturate the conventional assumptions about cities, that I propose to deal with it in this chapter as the first order of business. In the chapters that follow, I shall then describe what I have been able to learn about how cities grow, taking each part of the growth process separately. Thus, this first chapter is a prologue. We are all well aware from the history of science that ideas universally believed are not necessarily true. We are also aware that it is only after the untruth of such ideas has been exposed that it becomes apparent how pervasive and insidious their influence has been. To take an example, for thousands of years, otherwise intelligent men thought that those small animals found in rotten meat, cheese, and still water took form and came to life without parents. The environment, it was supposed, not only nourished them, it created them by a process called spontaneous generation. This theory seems to have gone unquestioned until the Renaissance, when a Florentine poet-physician demonstrated that maggots did not materialize in rotting meat if the meat had been screened from flies. He drew the proper inference that a new life arose from existing life, but just as his insight was gaining currency, the microscope was invented. Hitherto invisible bits of life now became visible. Their presence was promptly interpreted to be a new proof of spontaneous generation, and thus the dogma stood a full 2 centuries longer, buttressed ironically by the tools of science, until it was demolished by Pasteur in the 19th century. Pasteur repeated the Florentine experiment using bacteria instead of flies as his experimental animals and wine instead of meat as his medium. His findings were savagely attacked by the most eminent biologists of his time because the new knowledge demolished so much that they knew about biology. For although the dogma of spontaneous generation ostensibly explained only the origins of tiny organisms, belief in it had subtly distorted much other biological observation and theory. It had simply closed off, as already explained, some very interesting questions, such as how single-celled animals really do multiply, and had stultified the investigation and understanding of cells generally. For another thing, many biologists had invested their lives in rationalizing newly observed truths to conform with the traditional error. Those biologists with the most eminent reputations had frequently been the authors of the most elaborate and arcane rationalizations. In just such ways, I think, our understanding of cities and also of economic development generally has been distorted by the dogma of agricultural primacy. I plan to argue that this dogma is as quaint as the theory of spontaneous generation, being a vestige of pre-Darwinian intellectual history that has hung on past its time. The dogma of agricultural primacy says agriculture first, cities later. Behind the dogma lies the notion that in pre-Neolithic times, hunting men lived only in small and economically self-sufficient groups, finding their own food, making their own weapons, tools, and other manufactured goods. Not until some of these primitive groups learned to cultivate grain and raise uh, livestock, it is thought that settled and stable villages emerged, and not until the villages were built did complex division of labor, large economic projects, and intricate social organization become possible. These advances, coupled with the surplus of agricultural food, are supposed to have made cities possible. One school of thought, the older, holds that cities evolved slowly but directly out of villages that were at first simple agricultural units but gradually grew both larger and more complex. Another school holds that cities were organized by non-agricultural warriors who put peasants to work for them, in return protecting the peasants from other warriors. In either version, the food produced by agricultural work and workers is presumed to have been an indispensable foundation for cities. This sequence, first agricultural villages, then towns, then cities, ostensibly explains only the first cities, but the assumption has affected ideas of what cities are and what may be their place in the economic scheme of things, as well as historically. If it is true that cities could not have been developed before agricultural settlements appeared, then it follows that the development of agriculture and of rural resources in general is basic, and that cities, since they are supported upon rural development, are secondary. Thus villages certainly, and probably towns, would seem to be more important to human life than cities. It follows also that cities would differ from lesser settlements, primarily by being bigger and more complicated, or by being the seats of power. All these logical sequels to the dogma of original agriculture primacy underlie, often as unspoken assumptions, modern, practical attempts at planned economic development. They are not merely academic notions. In both Marxist and capitalist countries, these ideas are used as working assumptions. Cities have long been acknowledged as primary organs of cultural development, that is, of the vast and intricate collections of ideas and institutions called civilization, and I have no intention of laboring that point. Rather, my purpose now is to show that cities are also primary economic organs. To explain how this can be, I shall first touch upon modern and historical relationships between city and rural work, then conjecture what those relationships must have been in prehistoric times, and finally suggest why the conventional and contrary theory took hold. Cities and agricultural productivity. It can already be seen in the world today that agriculture is not even tolerably productive unless it incorporates many goods and services produced in cities or transplanted from cities. The most thoroughly rural countries exhibit the most unproductive agriculture. The most thoroughly urbanized countries, on the other hand, are precisely those that produce food most abundantly. A few years ago, the United States and the European Common Market engaged in what was called a chicken war. Each was trying to push its surfeit of chickens off onto the other. But this does not mean that the industrialized and urban economies of the United States and Western Europe were built upon surfeits of chickens. They simply produced surfeits of chickens. Surges in agricultural productivity follow the growth of cities. Japanese cities began their modern industrial and commercial growth in the latter part of the 19th century, and by World War II, Japan had become a highly urbanized country. During this time, although Japanese farmers were industrious and thrifty, the very models of these virtues, and although they used their land most carefully, neither they nor the city populations were well fed. Rice was the staff of life. For many Japanese, there was little else except wild food, fish from the sea. Yet Japan did not raise enough rice for her own people, and a full quarter of what they consumed had to be imported. It was the custom to ascribe this severe food deficit to Japan's small supply of arable soil. But after the war and during the 1950s, remarkable changes occurred in Japanese agriculture, changes that cannot be explained by catchwords like reform. Indeed, the Japanese have made advances that have not been made in countries where reform of agriculture, landholding, and rural life have all been pursued more determinedly and heroically. What happened in Japan was also a wonderfully effective commonplace. The rural world began receiving in vast amounts for the first time fertilizers, machines, electric power, refrigeration equipment, the results of plant and animal research, and a host of other tangible goods and services developed in cities, the same cities where the richest food markets already lay. Japanese agriculture rapidly achieved a degree of productivity that had been thought unattainable in the 1960s. Although the population was 25% larger than it had been before the war and total consumption of rice had soared, Japanese farmers were supplying all of Japan's rice. None was any longer imported. Even more interesting, the per capita consumption of rice had dropped a little, but not because of shortages. Like the steady long-term drop in starch consumption in the United States, this drop was caused by the availability of more abundant and varied foods. The farmers, in addition to supplying more rice, were producing so much more milk and other dairy products, false eggs, meat, fruits, and vegetables that the Japanese were not only eating more than before, they were eating better. Nowadays, when Japan imports food and pays for it with industrial products, she imports meats, not rice. If modern Japanese cities had waited to grow until a surplus of rural products could support their growth, they would be waiting still. Japan, reinventing its agriculture, has accomplished abruptly and rapidly what the United States did somewhat more gradually and Western Europe more gradually still. It created rural productivity upon a foundation of city productivity. There is no inherent reason why this cannot be done by other nations even more rapidly. Modern productive agriculture has been reinvented by grace of unclear hundreds of innovations that were exported from the cities to the countryside, transplanted to the countryside, or imitated in the countryside. We are accustomed to think of these innovations in large, rather abstract groupings: chemical fertilizers, mechanical sowers, cultivators, harvesters, tractors, and other substitutes for draft animals and hand labor, mechanical refrigeration pipes, sprinklers, pumps, and other modern irrigation equipment, laboratories for research into plant and animal diseases and their control, soil analysis and weather forecasting systems, new hybridized plants, marketing and transportation systems, canning, freezing and drying technologies, methods of spreading information. The list is long. To be sure, one can often find fertilizer factories, tractor plants, agricultural research stations, nurseries, and electric power plants located in the rural world far from cities, but these activities were not created there. This is so not because farmers and other rural people are less creative than city dwellers. The difference lies in the contrasting natures of rural and city economies, for it is in cities that new goods and services are first created. Even innovations created specifically for farming depend directly upon earlier developments of city work. For example, McCormick's first horse-drawn reaper was a tremendous innovation for farm work. Here was a machine that replaced hand implements and supple, complex hand movements. Although this idea and the device to carry it out were new to farm work, the same idea and devices similar in principle were already commonly used in industrial work. Nor could McCormick have manufactured the reaper if other industrial tools had not already been developed. The Industrial Revolution occurred first in cities and later in agriculture. Electricity is now as necessary to modern farming and farm life as it is to city work and city life. Yet as late as 1935, fewer than 5% of American farms had electricity. First, electric power and a great variety of devices to use it were added to the economies of city after city, then rapidly to the economies of towns, but only belated to the economy of the countryside. It is all very well to say that the length of the time this process took was the result of the reluctance of utility corporations to invest in rural electrification and also of their attempts to prevent anyone else from doing what they would not do themselves. But it is still true that these great innovations were added in cities and only after they had been developed and proved out were they received into the agricultural world. This pattern is typical and it explains how agricultural productivity lags behind urban productivity, why indeed there is no way to increase rural productivity first and city productivity later.